have the privilege of introducing Dr. David Downing, another co-director of the Wade Center. And I have the delight of having our next door neighbors here tonight so they can attest that we do live together. But that makes it very convenient. We're co-directors and married, and we are delighted, especially tonight, come on in, there's plenty of room, because this is unprecedented for the Wade. And as many of you know, the Wade Center is the most comprehensive collection of materials by and about C.S. Lewis and 6 of his influences in the world. And nevertheless, the Wade has never before produced a New York Times best-selling book. And I say the Wade because the book is essentially quotations by C.S. Lewis about writers and writing. And all of us at the Wade, the entire staff, participates in the preservation and promotion of C.S. Lewis. So we are all involved with this. It's just that David had the idea to put together a lot of these quotations, and it was a great project during COVID when we had to shut down the Wade. And it's kind of shocked us, the response that has come to this book. Here it is on writing and writers. And in the New York Times bestsellers column, someone says of this book, "This compendium of wisdom about writing, and by extension life, reminds us of the value of true prose." And it just says P-R-O-S without the E, but obviously there's a pun there, true prose, a pro at writing prose. Although maybe it's a typo. But I choose to believe it is a intentional pun. Lewis's advice is delightful, wise, and easy to follow. For instance, quote, and they quote Lewis, "You should hear every sentence you write as if it was being read aloud or spoken. If it does not sound nice, try again." So let me give you background about the compiler of this book. As many of you know, David Downing is the first Lewis scholar in history to publish a book that is a critical analysis of C.S. Lewis that was published by a secular university press. So before him, all the books about Lewis had been very, very good books, but here, the University of Massachusetts Press. And what was interesting about that process is David got a lot of pushback because C.S. Lewis is a Christian, and so when you publish a scholarly work, you have anonymous readers who assess the work and write up anonymously their perspective on it and whether it should be published or not published. And so both of us have gone through that multiple times. And one of the anonymous assessors of David's Planets in Peril, as it's called, which is about Lewis's Ransom trilogy, which is a series of science fiction novels, as many of you know, and no one had written a critical analysis. And this someone did not want this work to be published, and he just denounced it in the notes. And that happened to me with my first book as well, where this person so didn't want my book published that he or she said, "Well, this author uses the problematic phrase 'just as.'" Okay. It's like they were trying to come up with everything they could name. So David had to write a response and legitimize what he was doing. And the editors at the University of Massachusetts told him, "You have successfully countered the objections of the reader." Yes. But before this book, David wrote 2 other books that I've never told you about. And he doesn't know I'm telling you about them. In 1987, so he was just
5 years old.
He wrote a book that was published by Baker Publishing. You may be familiar with that. And it's called What You Know Might Not Be So. 220 Misinterpretations of Bible Text Explained. And it's quite good. And basically what he did is write up a lot of the things that his fundamentalist parents taught him about the Bible and showed that, well, if you really know the Hebrew and or Greek, that's not exactly what is happening. So his parents were a bit disconcerted. But then the next book is called, and this was 3 years later, 1990, 303 Dumb Spelling Mistakes and What You Can Do About Them. And he fought this title, and this one he did not win. The publisher, because the whole point of the book is if you can't spell, especially in the English language, it's not your fault. The English language is this accumulation of many different other languages, and that I suffered from that insofar as my mother named me Crystal Lorene, and Lorene, which was her middle name, which means the queen in French. But then when she went to put it on the birth certificate, she couldn't remember how to spell it. And she goes, I before E except after C. And I didn't find out till I was in grad school studying French that rather than the queen, the way my mother spelled my middle name, it means the female nothing. So you can benefit from, they aren't dumb spelling errors. And so he wanted to call it Imagine Yourself a Good Speller because he said you need to use your imagination as a memory tool. And some of our friends back in Santa Barbara, where we lived at the time, they just rolled their eyes and they just go, David, you're this intellectual. What are you doing, writing all these silly little mnemonics to remember how to spell? And the one that they really mocked him for was how to spell lieutenant. And that is a hard one to remember how to spell, especially if you're in England where they pronounce it lieutenant. And so there is an illustrator, and he had this, the illustrator draw a bunch of little ants with rifles on their shoulders, and then a bigger ant with epaulets. And he is pointing to them and saying, lie, you 10 ants. And our friends just mocked him. Well, then one of the friends got a job working in Washington, D.C. She was secretary to the Secretary of Education. And she had to write a memo to a lieutenant general. And then she goes, oh, how do I spell lieutenant? Lie, you 10 ants. So she had to write an apology letter to David. The reason I talk about those first 2 books is they're collections. And so David does have this interest in pulling together diverse sources that are related to each other. And that's exactly what this book on writing and writers does. So if you would welcome him now, he will be over there because he wants me to help read some of the passages that you will see on screen. David Downing.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much for that kind introduction. I find the introductions are more heartfelt when it's your fellow scholar and your colleague and your spouse. So I appreciate I actually am going to use this book next time I teach composition, because students don't hear their prose. I will get one that I literally had a sentence that said, the alienation throughout the nation was caused by urbanization, industrialization, immigration, and and I kind of go, is this turning into a rap song? What's happening here? Students don't hear their prose. So yeah, he has some good advice about listening to your prose. Okay, so
tell them the one. I'm sorry. See, this is what you get for having me up here.
It's time for the Q&A.
He actually had an opening sentence of a student paper that says, if a man or person commits a violent act of God, he should not be crucified at the stake. And it's one of those, when you're a composition teacher, you're going, where do I even begin?
Yeah, that may have been the day we decided to come to Wheaton. I said, Crystal, get the U-Haul. We're going somewhere else. Okay, this project is called C.S. Lewis on Writing and Writers. And I'll show you some of the good reviews. Anytime you don't see 5 stars all filled in, you always wonder why the last star isn't filled in. And I'm enough of a masochist that I looked it up. One of the low reviews said, I got this book and the pages were all crinkled and I had to return it. And I go, is that my fault or C.S. Lewis's fault? You know, who's in charge of crinkled pages? And another one said, I thought this was a new book by C.S. Lewis, but it's just a collection of things he's already written. And I go, it says on the title, a miscellany of advice and opinions. He's been dead for 60 years. So in a way, Lewis talked about the habitual baseless ignorance of reviewers. And sometimes I see some of the low reviews, they have entitled their opinion, but other times they're rather strange. So this came out last November, and the title, C.S. Lewis on Writing and Writers. I'm happy to sign them for you after this presentation. If you had Lewis's signature, it would start at about $1,000. So if you can trace that with black ink and claim that Lewis signed that, then it's going to be a lot more valuable. Yes, I just took this anthology and took the obvious categories of fiction writing, poetry writing, Christian writing, and just found I own virtually all of Lewis's books and I have notes on all of them. So it was a good project during the COVID quarantine to just go through and pick out my favorite standalone quotes. So it's been reviewed in the New York Times very well. A third review came out in the Times just this week, so they're excited about it. I just wanted to mention, it doesn't really go to my head to get these good reviews because they're reviewing Lewis. I understand that. This is an anthology. An anthology means a gathering of flowers. So he scattered the blossoms of insight as well as the sharp thorns. I just gathered them and put them in a pot. I was looking at how my book was doing, and I noticed that Narnia Chronicles is still the #1 bestseller 60 years after his death in epic fantasy. So he's someone who succeeded so well as a writer. He's definitely worth listening to in terms of advice on writing. We also, a lot of people don't know, apart from the Narnia Chronicles, which have sold over 100 million copies, he also was a very influential literary critic. I love the idea that you're going past the Bird and Baby, the Eagle and Child pub in Oxford, and you see these two tweedy old professors talking about linguistics and mythology and fantasy. And someone says, do you know one of those is going to write a story which is going to sell over 100 million copies? And you say, well, really, which one? Well, actually, both of them will. Tolkien will and Lewis will. They'll both go past 100. But he was also a very influential professor and then a great philosopher and lay theologian. If you go to the category in Amazon called Christian Literature and Art, of the top 20 books, 14 of them are by Lewis. One of them, this one on letters. The only people who crowded in wedges between Lewis were Augustine's Confessions and Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress. So that's pretty good company to keep. When they say #1 bestseller, they mean in a certain category. I realized the way to do it would be to write a book about Swedish tuba players and get that thing published. I think that would go to #1 in that category. But in any case, it's doing quite well. He was a wonderful writer, and so you certainly want to listen to his advice about writing and his opinions about other writers. I'm just going to give you a lot of samples. I'll read one, and then Crystal will read one. No man who values originality will ever be original, but try to tell the truth as you see it. Try to do any bit of work as well as can be done for the work's sake, and what men call originality will come unsought. All the way through, he uses man to be human, so you have to get used to the fact that he's writing in the last century. It's not very inclusive language, but he was thinking inclusively. So here's one of the most original writers of the 20th century, and his advice is try not to be original. Don't set out to be original.
You describe your wonderful night, and this is in a letter to Joan Lancaster. You describe your wonderful night very well. That is, you describe the place and the people and the night and the feeling of it all very well, but not the thing itself. The setting, but not the jewel. If you become a writer, you'll be trying to describe the thing all your life. And lucky if, out of dozens of books, 1 or 2 sentences, just for a moment, come near to getting it across.
He was amazing that he would receive letters from children, and they would send him samples of their writing, and he would take them very seriously, and he would write serious critiques. I'll show you the next page is continuing to Joan Lancaster. So one of my resources for this book was Letters to Children, the book that was edited by our own Marjorie Lamp Mead. And he would give the same seriousness to a 10-year-old as he would to a internationally known author or critic. Okay, this is more advice to Joan Lancaster. Around here, do you say Lancaster or Lancaster? In California, they say Lancaster, and in Pennsylvania, they say Lancaster. So I don't know how this young lady wants. So he actually sat down and gave her advice. Always try to use the language so as to make it quite clear what you mean and make sure your sentence couldn't mean anything else.
Always prefer the plain, direct word to the long, vague one. Don't implement promises, but keep them.
Example of #1, I wanted to give an example of headlines, especially they try to cut out words. So there's a newspaper headline where it says, "Man gets life in violin case." And it sounds like, so be careful. Make sure those words mean what you think they mean. Never use abstract nouns when concrete ones will do. If you mean more people died, don't say mortality rose. I wrote a paper as an undergrad where I said something about suicide, and I said suicidal thoughts is a sign of depression. And my psych professor crossed it out and put suicidal ideation. So that sounds more professional, and you've got this knowledgeable diagnosis, ideation. I still think suicidal thoughts sort of covers the same idea. #4, Crystal.
Don't use adjectives which merely tell us how you want us to feel about the thing you are describing. I mean, instead of telling us a thing was terrible, describe it so that we'll be terrified. Don't say it was delightful. Make us say delightful when we've read the description. You see, all those words, horrifying, wonderful, hideous, exquisite, are only like saying to your readers, "Please, will you do my job for me?"
Yeah, this is what they say, show, don't tell. Try to create the actual primary sensory experiences. 5, don't use words too big for the subject. Don't say infinitely when you mean very. Otherwise, you'll have no word left when you want to talk about something really infinite. Good advice to a 10-year-old. Good advice to someone of any age trying to write. The power of style. Go ahead, Crystal, you can read this. This is to his friend, his teenage friend back in Northern Ireland, Arthur Greaves.
And was this when Lewis was in the trenches?
17, somewhere close to that.
Okay.
He arrived in the trenches of World War I on his 19th birthday.
Okay.
Yeah, so this somewhere, August 4th.
You have started the question of prose style in your letter and ask whether it is anything more than the literal meaning of the words. On the contrary, it means less. It means the words themselves. For every thought can be expressed in a number of different ways, and style is the art of expressing a given thought in the most beautiful words and rhythms of words. For instance, a man might say, "When the constellations which appear at early morning joined in musical exercises and the angelic spirits loudly testified to their satisfaction." Expressing exactly the same thought, the Authorized or King James Version says, "When the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy." Thus, by the power of style, what was nonsense becomes ineffably beautiful.
Power of style. This is on plagiarism. Every professor has plagiarism on their mind. This was Lewis's comment on a student copying someone else's work and pretending it's his or her own. "I only once detected a pupil offering me someone else as his own work. I told him I was not a detective nor even a schoolmaster, not a nurse. I absolutely refused to take any precaution against this puerile trick." I guess I'll keep that I'd soon think my business to see that he washed behind his ears or wiped his bottom. He went down of his own accord for the next week, and I never saw him again. Went down means you left Oxford. "I think you ought to make a great general announcement of that sort. What staggers me is how any man could prefer the galley slave labor of transcription to the free man's work of attempting an essay on his own." It's a good comment on plagiarism. How are you going to stretch your mental muscles if you're simply copying someone else's thoughts?
The writing process. Ink is the great cure. Whenever you are fed up with life, start writing. Ink is the great cure for all human ills, as I have found out long ago. And then ink is also a deadly drug. Ink is a deadly drug. One wants to write. I cannot shake off the addiction.
So this is 35 years later. That picture is of Parker Quink ink, which means quick ink. It dried very quickly, so you didn't tend to smear it. This was his favorite kind of ink. Both he and Tolkien liked to write with a dip pen. They thought it gave you time to think about your next phrase. We have Tolkien's dip pen, and it's got ink on the nib end. The other end is kind of browned and curled up because he would tamp out his tobacco pipe while he was writing. So he was multitasking. I was asking Laura Schmidt, our archivist, what some of the strange requests she got for research work. And the Quink comes in blue and in black. And someone wrote and said, "I have this theory that Lewis used different ink depending on his mood. Could you send me a list of all of his letters and what color they're written in?" Which would be about 4,000 letters. And then, luckily, we have mostly copies. So she was able to say, well, our copies are all black. So can you imagine? Okay, academic writing versus imaginative writing. Fellow scholar Alistair Fowler, who was a well-known scholar who finished Lewis's book called Spencer's Images of Life for him, took his class notes and turned it into a book. But he said, how can you balance academic writing and imaginative writing? I don't get how you make time for both. And Lewis said, academic work and imaginative writing are incompatible only in the same sense as playing the piano and taking hot baths. They can't be done at the same time. He didn't really see the problem. He didn't see why you couldn't switch from being an academic to being a creative writer.
Why can I never say anything once? 2 and 2 make 4. These pairs in union generate quaternity, and the duplication of duplicates leaves us 1 short of 5. Well, all's one, plague of these pickled herrings.
That was, Owen Barfield, his good friend and fellow Inkling, who was a lawyer that came to many of the meetings up at the Eagle and Child, had told him his prose tended to be redundant. So this is Lewis's humorous reply. The Eagle and Child, many of you been to Oxford? They're refurbishing it now, but for a while you could go there and see the exact place where all the Inklings gathered. Recent scholars feel the need to come up. They called it the bird and baby, the Inklings. It's an image of who's the little boy being carried off on the back of an eagle. I can't remember who the little boy is. It's a Greek myth. They called it the bird and the baby. Modern critics have to come up with their own names. So my name is the swooper and the pooper. I think Michael Ward's was the flyer and the crier. So you have to come up, if you go to Oxford, you have to come up with a new name for that pub. Okay, so he was aware that he had a tendency toward redundancy sometimes. This is Walter Hooper talking about Lewis's writing process. Did you read this?
You stuck me with the last one.
Oh, okay.
So.
Oh, that's right. Walter Hooper said, I asked Lewis how he managed to write with such ease, and I think his answer tells us more about his writing than anything else he said. He told me that the thing he most loved about writing is that it did two things at once. This he illustrated by saying, I don't know what I mean until I see what I've said. In other words, writing and thinking were a single process. So Walter Hooper was the young American who went to visit Lewis in '63, about 6 months before Lewis passed away. And they were quick friends that summer, and he ended up being Lewis's literary executor. Many of the great books that have come out since Lewis passed away are by Walter Hooper, who just passed himself of COVID 2 years ago. So, but I don't know how many of you are writers, but often when you sit down, you haven't formed your opinion yet, or you haven't decided where you're going, and the process of writing actually carries your thoughts along rather than the other way around.
On children's writing, where the children's story is simply the right form for what the author has to say, then of course readers who want to hear that will read the story or reread it at any age. I never met the Wind in the Willows or the Bastable books till I was in my late 20s, and I do not think I have enjoyed them any less on that account. I am almost inclined to set it up as a canon that a children's story which is enjoyed only by children is a bad children's story. The good ones last. A waltz which you can like only when you are waltzing is a bad waltz.
It's a great metaphor, but I want to say, have you done a lot of waltzing there, Jack? You know, I can't quite see you. He didn't like parties and he didn't like dancing. He said when he was a little child, people would invite him to a party and say, well, why? I never invited you to a party. He thought that was some sort of retribution. So he had a lot to say in this book about children's writing, really defending fantasy as a valuable genre. He and Tolkien both. They both won the argument, because now if you go to the film, everything is comic book movies and adolescent adventures, and if anything, the pendulum swung too far in the other direction, I think. When they were writing, nobody took fantasy literature seriously as a literary genre. On Christian writing.
I think you have a mistaken idea of a Christian writer's duty. We must use the talent we have, not the talents we haven't. We must not, of course, write anything that will flatter lust, pride, or ambition, but we needn't all write patently moral or theological work. Indeed, work whose Christianity is latent may do quite as much good and may reach some whom the more obvious religious work would scare away. The first business of a story is to be a good story. When our Lord made a wheel in the carpenter's shop, depend upon it, it was first and foremost a good wheel. Don't try to bring in specifically Christian bits. If God wants you to serve him in that way, he may not, there are different vocations, you will find it coming in of its own accord. If not, well, a good story which will give innocent pleasure is a good thing, just like cooking a good, nourishing meal. You don't put little texts in your family soup, I'll be bound. By the way, none of my stories began with a Christian message. I always start from a mental picture. The floating islands, a fawn with an umbrella in a snowy wood, an injured human head. Of course, my nonfiction works are different, but they succeed because I'm a professional teacher, and explanation happens to be one of the things I've learned to do. But the great thing is to cultivate one's own garden, to do well the job which one's own natural capacities point out, after first doing well whatever the duties of one's station impose. Any honest workmanship, whether making stories, shoes, or rabbit hutches, can be done to the glory of God.
Thank you, Crystal. The story about you don't put little text in your family soup, this is rather digressive, but I have a twin brother, and he and I got married a week apart. I was his best man, then he was my best man. The first summer, we were
And we
taking
had our
care of a-
honeymoons together.
No.
We did.
In any case, so we both went off to work every day, and they made us turkey sandwiches. So one day they decided to put notes in the sandwich, like here's the turkey, here's the lettuce, here's the mayo. And little note says, "I love you. I hope you're having a good day." So we come home at the end of the day, both of us. They say, "How did you like the little message in your sandwich?" My brother and I both went, "What message?" I didn't see any message. So you have to be careful about putting little text. So one section is just his opinion of other authors. A lot of it's advice to youngsters, advice to actual published novelists. He would take it upon himself. The person has already published the novel, and he would say, if you want to publish another novel, here's some advice. And it's all good advice. So he was very willing to share his opinions tactfully but forthrightly. He loved the classics. Chaucer has few rivals and no masters. Dante remains a strong candidate for the supreme poetical honors of the world. His favorites he went back and back to were the Divine Comedy and the Prelude by Wordsworth, and the Iliad, not the Iliad, the Aeneid by Virgil. And so his whole life he would just read those over and over and over again. Other writers, classic and contemporary. This is the Wade Center, but this is what he wrote. Her books have only two faults, and both damnable. They're too few and too short. You've heard of a backhanded compliment. That's sort of a backhanded insult. Don't you think? It sounds like an insult. But so he loved Austen. He also read her and reread her his whole life.
In Dumas, if you try to look even an inch behind the immediate intrigue, you find just nothing at all. You are in an abstract world of gallantry and adventure which has no roots, no connection with human nature or Mother Earth. When the scene shifts from Paris to London, there's no sense that you have reached a new country, no change of atmosphere. And I don't think there is a single passage to show that Dumas had ever seen a cloud, a road, or a tree. In a word, if you were asked to explain what you and I meant by the homely in literature, you could almost reply, it means the opposite of the Three Musketeers. But perhaps I'm being too hard on what, after all, was written only for amusement. I suppose there must be a merit in the speed and verve of the plot, even if I don't like that kind of thing.
So he couldn't even read light literature without critiquing, where's the atmosphere, where's the texture, where's the background? Yeah,
yes,
the Fast and Furious.
The Fast and Furious. Yeah,
and
good.
we go back and read the novel, Three Musketeers. It does read that way. It's just this breakneck plot, which not much development or texture or background. He didn't like T.S. Eliot, and generally didn't like the modernist poets or the modernist novelists. One of Eliot's most famous poems is the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, which begins, "Let us go then, you and I, when the evening is spread out against the sky, like a patient etherized upon a table." And it's kind of a shocking metaphor that the evening is spread out. I actually like the poem.
Yeah,
I think
me
Prufrock
too.
is brilliant poetry. Lewis had very conservative taste when it came to poetry. So he wrote a poem critiquing the poem. So this is C.S. Lewis on Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock. "I am so coarse, the thing the poets see are obstinately invisible to me. For 20 years I've stared my level best to see if evening, any evening, would suggest a patient etherized upon a table. In vain, I simply wasn't able. To me, each evening looked far more like the departure from a silent yet a crowded shore, of a ship whose freight was everything, leaving behind, gracefully, finally, without farewells, marooned mankind." And then the poem goes on. It's very classic Lewis to not see it in clinical terms, but to see it in romantic terms. Somehow that departing sun is like this great frigate which is leaving humanity behind. As I say, I generally agree with Lewis's opinions, but I do think Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock is a brilliant poem, and I'm going to defend that metaphor. They say a picture's worth 1,000 words. The patient etherized upon a table. I give you So don't you think Eliot had a point there? I think I'm going to send that to Eliot. He also didn't like T.S. Eliot as a critic. So he started out as a great poet, wrote The Wasteland. Lewis said, he and his friends called it the wastebasket. And he said, Dante, the Inferno is not infernal poetry, but the Wasteland is. So this is his take on, this is to Dorothy Sayers. He didn't like Eliot as a critic either.
Oh, Eliot. How can a man who is neither a knave nor a fool write so like both? Well, he can't complain that I haven't done my best to put him right. Hardly ever write a book without showing him one of his errors, and still he doesn't mend. I call it ungrateful.
They actually met in later life. They got off to a rocky start because Eliot was famous for his modernist poetry and his shocking imagery and his disjointed stanzas, which he took to be sort of a symbol of the modern culture. And then he became a critic, but he actually became a Christian before Lewis did. He satirizes Eliot again in Pilgrim's Regress. He calls him Mr. Neo-Angular because he became an Anglican. They finally met in the 50s. They were working together on a revision of the Psalter for the Book of Common Prayer and discovered they had a lot in common after all. And in a way, in some alternate universe, I wish that he and Eliot could have gotten together much earlier in life. They would have made an amazing team of Christian cultural influencers. But that didn't happen until late in life. They had a couple of lunches with their wives before Joy passed away. Emerson, did I do the last one? Did you do the last one?
I did the last one.
Ralph Waldo Emerson. He often will admire an American writer and then he'll put an ending just like this one. You are quite right about Emerson. I often pick him up here for an odd quarter of an hour and go away full of new ideas. Every sentence is weighty. He puts into paragraphs what others, seeking charm, expand into whole essays or chapters. I don't know why you object to his style. It seems to me admirable. What a pity that such a man should be in America. that little coda comes in a number of his letters about American writers.
The King James Bible. I am not convinced that its rhythms, they are various, are very different from those of any good prose that is written for the most part in short sentences, nor that they would strike us as noticeably fine if divorced from their matter. After the cocktail, a soup, but the soup was not very nice, and after the soup, a small cold pie. It is not a bad sentence, but it is very different from its rhythmical equivalent. After the earthquake, a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire, and after the fire, a still small voice.
So there's a lot of talk about the rhythms of the King James Bible and its wonderful melodious prose. When you're talking about how to spell prose, a great idea for a book is you go to a penitentiary and start a writing group and you get memoirs and therapy. There's a lot of writing as therapy. And you take all the best ones and you publish them. And the title of the book would be Pros and Cons. I just thought of that while you were talking about that. Yeah, okay, so somebody took that away somewhere. So he's trying to make the point. I love the idea that he's looking at this famous passage and trying to come up with the most insipid sentence he can come up with the exact same rhythms and accents as the famous passage in 1 Kings.
In fact, this book has just been re-released, this English literature in the 16th century.
That's right, yeah. Almost all of the books are still in print. It's amazing for someone who's been dead 60 years. He was afraid when he passed away that his brother, who was living on his army pension, his brother Warren, he said, if I stop writing books, I don't know if he's going to have enough to live on. Little did he know that anybody involved with the Lewis estate would be very well off for at least a generation or two. Mm-hmm. Carmen?
Did he say that someone was a barrister that, no one would care what I've written 5 years after I'm gone?
Yeah, he did say that. Yeah, he did say that. He was not a great prophet.
Repeat what he said.
Oh, he said I think it's Owen Barfield, nobody will read what I've written 5 minutes after I've passed away, which is generally true. When an author dies, often the interest falls away. He was not a very good prophet. He also said in 1950, I feel like my creative juices are spent. I don't know if I can write anything else to please my audiences. And he was just bringing out the Narnia Chronicles. So he was very insightful in many ways, but not as a prophet about his own life and his own writings. Did I do that one? Did you do that one?
I did it.
Modern novels, poems, and pictures. This is good work and good works. Crystal, who loves Dorothy Sayers and writes a lot of books about Dorothy Sayers, loves the concept that the only Christian work is good work well done. And often when you're reading Lewis, you feel that connection between Lewis and Sayers. Many modern novels, poems, and pictures, which we are browbeaten into appreciating, are not good work because they are not work at all. They are mere puddles of spilled sensibility or reflection. When an artist is in the strict sense working, he of course takes into account the existing taste, interest, and capacity of his audience. These, no less than the language, the marble, or the paint, are part of his raw material, to be used, tamed, sublimated, not ignored or defied. Haughty indifference to them is not genius nor integrity. It is laziness and incompetence. So he was amazingly plain spoken at a time where it was very hard to say these things because modernism was the dominant cultural trend, but that didn't daunt he or Tolkien very much. Tristram
Shandy. I have read today some 10 pages of Tristram Shandy, and I am wondering whether I like it. It is certainly the maddest book ever written. It gives you the impression of an escaped lunatic's conversation while chasing his hat on a windy May morning.
Once again, it's 1916. He's writing this clever prose as a teenager. He's reading Tristram Shandy. He tackled Dante, Shakespeare, all the classics in Greek and Latin, Chaucer, and as a teenager. He considered that to be leisure reading after he was doing all his language work. When I was his age, I think I had a paper route when I was that age. But he was even as a teenager, he was a very clever critic.
The Sword in the Stone is one of the most deeply vulgar books I've ever read. Its humor is exactly on the level of an urchin with a lead pencil drawing a mustache on the lip of a classical statue. It is the work of a sad, shabby little mind.
Ouch. That last phrase, I just read this for the first time. I had a set of student papers, and a number of them didn't try very hard. So I was reading one, and I started to put, this is the work of it. No, that's Lewis could do that. I can't do that. So I haven't used that phrase yet, but I thought that was a great short review of, he didn't like it because it has all these anachronisms. He wanted the real romance and the feeling that you're in the Middle Ages. And when you start bringing up stopwatches and bicycles and all that, he considered that to be spoiling the spell of being in another world. I don't want to end on a negative note, so let's give some of his comments on The Lord of the Rings. He wrote a glowing review of The Lord of the Rings when it came out. This is the first sentence or the first paragraph and the last paragraph of his review of Lord of the Rings. I'll read the first one, Crystal, and you can finish, okay? This book is like lightning from a clear sky, as sharply different, as unpredictable in our age as Song of Innocence were in theirs, Blake's famous poems. To say that in it heroic romance, gorgeous, eloquent, and unashamed, has suddenly returned at a period almost pathological in its anti-romanticism is inadequate. To us who live in that odd period, the return and the sheer relief of it is doubtless the important thing.
The book is too original and too opulent for any final judgment on a first reading. But we know at once that it has done things to us. We are not quite the same men, and though we must ration ourselves in our rereadings, I have little doubt that the book will soon take its place among the indispensables.
So that's his review of Tolkien. So we'll end on a high note there rather than the sad, shabby little mind. Okay, that's just a sample of his advice and opinions and his thoughts on other authors.
And if there's questions from the audience, I'll pass around. I'll hand you a mic so we can hear your question. Hey, Justice.
Just a quick comment about rereadings of Lord of the Rings.
Right.
Christopher Lee, who played Saruman in the movies, he read it every year all the way through.
Wow.
Yeah,
Wow.
so he was actually sort of a consultant. He'd met Tolkien. He says, and he'd say, Peter, this is the way you should do this.
Wow. Any other comments or questions? Yeah.
I just had a question more so about his education. It seems like he probably would have read the Greek or Latin classics in those languages.
Right.
For us living in modernity, we probably don't have the luxury to learn those languages. So, I mean, how would you say we should supplement our own English educations or our own edification or reaching? How should we? What things can we do practically without diving entirely into, learning Latin or learning Greek?
Right.
That we don't really have the time to do. How can we still develop that eloquence, or how can we still develop that taste in prose, or how can we do what the old Englishmen used to do?
That is a good question. Lewis, one of his advice about writing, he starts by saying, turn off your radio. He didn't want contemporary noise, and if he lived now, he'd be amazed how much is going on beyond radio. He also said you should write longhand rather than using a typewriter, because the clackety-clack of the typewriter messes up your ear for the prose you're writing. So a lot of his advice would be hard to take now, I agree. When he and Tolkien were going to school, they don't have the American idea of breadth. They didn't have breadth requirements. So you tended to choose an area and then go into it in great depth. The classics and languages was it for Tolkien and Lewis. So I think part of that we can never recreate. He, in his memoir, he says the perfect day for him involved 8 hours of reading. And he would start after breakfast, read all morning, take a lunch break. He often said he read during lunch, and then would take a walk or get some exercise and then read again in the evening. I don't think many of us have the luxury to read and write 8 hours a day. I do think it's good advice. He said, don't read magazines, just read books. I'm working on a book right now about all of his animal imagery, kind of the same idea, but and he says, Time magazine had him on the cover with after the screw tape letters, and there was an angel and devil on one shoulder. And he said, it was full of untruths and misleading statements. I won't call them lies because journalists don't have enough mental clarity to tell the truth. To call a journalist a liar is like saying a dog is really bad at mathematics. So he uses this dog image. I think a lot of it has to do with reading a lot of different kinds of literature rather than, right now, people have their own little cultural world where they read this kind of journalism or this kind of journalism, this kind of novel, that kind of novel. And so a part of it has to do with giving yourself breadth, even just in the English language. Lewis was so in-depth when it came to Greek and Latin. He had a photographic memory. But in conversation, somebody would mention Tito, and he would say, now who's that? Is that the king of Greece? So he was wonderful in literature and philosophy and classics, but sometimes he was surprisingly ignorant in other areas. I'm not quite sure how to answer your question. Our cultural milieu is so different. I would say make a lot more time for reading, journaling, and read a diversity of things rather than getting into a certain groove which just reinforces your opinions and your worldview.
May I add my 2 bits to answer that question?
Shouldn't you write a book first?
I did.
Oh, you did? Crystal has a book coming out called, it's on faith and film, and it's called The Wages of Cinema.
I would also suggest...
It's going to be with a C.
It's a pun. I would encourage all people who are interested in writing to set up a writing group, like the Inklings. When I was teaching in Pennsylvania, we were both teaching at separate colleges in Pennsylvania, I started a writing group among my female colleagues at the college, and we called ourselves the Pinklings. And we would just come and we would pass around in advance articles we were working on, parts of books we were working on, and just get together and talk about it, what worked, what didn't work. And it just, that way, I was benefiting because my colleagues weren't all I'm an English professor, my colleagues weren't all in the English department. So there were social scientists, there were people from theater, there were people from the arts. So I was benefiting from their education when they could comment on, well, you know, this is what a psychologist would say about what you're doing here. And we'd have these great discussions. The cover of, and we all know that Lewis was part of the Inklings, and David was being interviewed. I think it was about this book. He was doing a radio interview, and he made the point that if it hadn't have been for C.S. Lewis, we never would have heard of Tolkien. Because Lewis just encouraged Tolkien to get his work done, send it out for publication. Tolkien was a tinkerer. And at the same time, we wouldn't have heard of
Lewis. I
Lewis.
said we might not have heard of Lewis if it wasn't for Tolkien, because Tolkien was instrumental in Lewis's conversion.
Oh, right.
And the radio interviewer said, yes, and if it wasn't for Lewis and Tolkien, we might never have heard of you, which I thought was kind of uncalled for. You know, I don't know why you thought of that story, Kristen.
Well, it's about the generation of insight from writing groups.
You know, back to your question, as I was looking at this category of books and reading, there's a book called 1,000 Books to Read Before You Die. It's on the same bestseller list. And I started looking at the table of contents and these little blurbs, and it was really interesting. That would make a great project, just to pick out, you know, classic and contemporary, New World, Old World, Middle East, Eastern. So if you're ever convicted of like Grand Theft Auto and you have like 5 or 10 years on your hands, I would get those 1,000 books and work through them.
Any other? Let's go over here.
Hey, David, this is great. I just had one question for you. You've studied Lewis for decades now. I'm curious, in this project, did anything jump out at you that was sort of an insight or a new aha? Did you see anything about his perspective on writing in a different way, or something that, did you draw some incredible insight that you hadn't seen, or some idea that you put together that you hadn't before now? I'm curious if there was any of those kinds of ahas.
I think the main thing that struck me, I literally went through all of his books and then all of his letters, which is a good thing to do during the quarantine. The main thing that struck me was how he was still so connected to his childhood emotionally. He still loved Wind in the Willows. He loved Edith Nesbit. Sometimes he would recommend a book. There's one called Giant Land. And from his description, you think it's this really clever fantasy story about these children. And you read the actual book, and it's just so basic. It's almost like Goodnight Moon. I think that's one of the things that struck me, is he had very sophisticated sensibilities as a literary critic, but emotionally, he's never lost touch with the child within himself. He kept recommending books in his 40s and 50s that most of us would think you'd stop reading, you know, after you were 8 or 9. He said, when I was a child, I liked lemon squash. Now I like lemon squash and port wine. But why do you have to give up the lemon squash to enjoy the port wine? He felt like development is growing and adding rather than leaving something behind. So I think that's the main thing that struck me, is how much he never stopped talking. He would talk about Tolstoy and Shakespeare. In the next letter, he's talking about Giant Land and Edith Nesbit. It was just such an interesting, his reading was connected to his entire life, not just his life as an adult critic.
He also, in one of his letters to children, said, when I was 12 years old, part of me was 50, and now that I'm 50, parts of me are 12 years old. And, you know, he never had his own children, but he was able to channel how children think because parts of him were still 12.
That's in Letters to Children. That's one of the letters that Marge edited. When I first read that as a young scholar, I said, that's so great that an old man of 50 still remembers the emotions. And now I go, 50? What's the matter with 50? You know? It's not so old. Perspectives change.
Any other comments or questions? Thank you so much. David is going to go out, and there is a table where if you want to buy a copy of the book, then you can buy them at our reception desk, and he'll sign them for you. So why don't you go
Sneak out. Okay.
sneak out?
Thanks for
Oh,
coming,
yes.
you all. All right.